Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Bron, and on behalf of everyone at Better Read Than Dead, we're delighted you could join us on Zoom to celebrate Danielle Celermajer's wonderful book, Summertime. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you'd like not to be filmed, please turn off your camera settings. Before we begin the proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. These will be different depending on where you're zooming in from. For me, it's the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It's upon their ancestral lands that Better Read Than Dead is built. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now to our guests. Philosopher Danielle Celermajer is an academic at the University of Sydney. Her story of Jimmy the Pig caught the world's attention during the Black Summer of 2019-2020. She has written two previous books, The Prevention of Torture and The Sins of the Nation and The Ritual of Apologies. She's a regular on Radio National's The Minefield with Waleed Ali and Scott Stevens and The Philosopher's Zone. She's also written for the Sydney Morning Herald, The Guardian and The Conversation. Tonight, Danielle will appear in conversation with Scott Stevens. Scott is the editor of ABC's Religion and Ethics website and specialist commentator on religion and ethics for ABC Radio and Television. He has published widely on moral philosophy, theology and political theory, and is currently writing a book on whether public ethics can survive in a media age. It's a pleasure to have them both here tonight to celebrate the release of this fabulous book, and it should be a fascinating discussion. Finally, before we get started, please note there'll be a Q&A session towards the end of tonight's event. You can type any questions you have for Danielle or Scott into the group chat, and they'll answer them via video once the time comes. Without further ado, I'll pass over to Scott to get the ball rolling.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much for that. And thank you all for being here. I assume that this is something that a lot of people are doing these days, getting into large conversations by Zoom. This is my first Zoom, even though we have regular sort of other video meetings. So I hope I don't gum this one up too much. This is thoroughly wonderful, by the way, to be in conversation about this book. A book that I regard as being one of the most singularly important books to appear in recent times. And it's a special delight to be in conversation with my dearest friend whom I've never met. Danny and I have never actually spoken one another in a way that we can see each other apart from this particular meeting. So Danny, thanks so much for being willing to do this.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Better Read Than Dead, for the opportunity to speak in a group like this.
So the way that I have this conversation kind of flowing in my mind is around three passages that I'd love for you to read in the book. Passages that I think illustrate the moral intensity of the book, and it is a very intense book. They're passages of unspeakable beauty. They're passages that I can't read without weeping after I read them. And I want to give a sense, I suppose, of how this book feels, what the experience is of reading it. But just before we do that, Danny, I wonder if you'd like to say something about how the book itself came about. I'll confess I'm deeply invested in how this particular book came about. I have a real emotional attachment to it. But it really is a labor, and it doesn't strike me that on one level, you didn't need to write this book. On another level, you had to write this book. And I'm wondering how it is that you wrote it.
Thank you. I just want to also acknowledge that I'm on the land and waters of the Dharawal people, and really to thank elders past and present and all of the living beings who make this place, who made it possible for me to live here and be here. So we should have some true confessions. Scott is not just invested in this, but he is entangled in it. He is very much part of the story of the writing of this book, as modest as he is. So on New Year's Eve, on the 31st of December 2019, this is where the book opens. I was here where I am now. We were evacuating. My partner, who's known as Elle in the book, was on his way to Sydney with a truck full of our belongings because we had emptied what was precious to us in the house. The animals had been evacuated, and I received a call from a very dear friend who was caring for two of the pigs that we live with, Jimmy and Kate, to tell me that the fire had completely surrounded her place and that everything was burnt, and that at that point she thought Katie and Jimmy were both dead. It later turned out that Jimmy had survived the fire, but we didn't find that out till the next day. And that day, I won't go through everything that happened, but we ended up driving to Sydney because we were evacuating ourselves because we thought the fire was going to come here. And during that day, I live near a town which is quite a touristy town, and I drove into town to get some batteries for the torch, and there were people having coffee and walking around, and meanwhile my neighbours and my community were in this desperation of leaving, of saving what could be saved. And I was, to be frank, I was enraged. I was in profound distress about what I perceived to be this split in the experience of what is otherwise in some ways a single country. And later that night when we drove to Sydney, the fireworks were still going ahead, the fireworks while the South Coast was burning. And as we now know, billions of living beings were having their lives destroyed in the most horrific way. And out of that sense of rage and despair, and confusion isn't quite the right word, but I was distraught at what I saw. And so I had to write. While Elle, as you know, I'm going to call him Elle because that's who is in the book. While Elle was driving back, I sat down and I wrote that first piece about Two Australias. And I actually sent it to Scott, who has published me at different times. And that piece ended up being edited when we were driving back to Sydney. I was driving because Elle was exhausted. Scott and Elle were on the phone and we were doing the edits on the piece. So that I say that because it gives the flavour of the book being written in these conditions of desperation. Then a few days later, I wrote another piece about On the Side. And that piece similarly came from my sense that what I was seeing was so crystal clear, this the gargantuan nature of the destruction, the terror that people were feeling, the way in which this catastrophe that had always been looming on the horizon was now literally at our door. And so I felt, as someone who was living it, but who is also a writer, that I needed to both understand it myself, writing as a way of, for me, of making sense of what's going on, this confusion of feelings and thoughts and experience. Writing helps me to cut through some of that. But more importantly, I felt like I needed to convey some of the immediacy of what I was experiencing and how I was making sense of it to my fellow Australians. So it was very much, but it was simultaneously an internal process of sense making for me, but also a way of connecting and trying to get others to shift their understanding of what was going on in the way that mine had been so radically shifted through the immediacy of the experience. So those were the beginnings of the book. And then after that, Nikki Christa from, sorry.
No. Well, wonderful. Just hold that there for a second. I might get you, Danny, to pick up your copy of the book. If you haven't seen the book, everyone, by the way, there it is. Danny, if you wouldn't mind turning in your hymnal to page 76. I'm just going to get you in a moment to read a passage for us. One of the things that I do in the ABC is I'm an opinion editor. If you've listened to a recent episode of The Minefield, many of you might know exactly how I feel about a lot of what goes by the name of opinion writing. I'm very, very upset by, distraught by, underwhelmed by a great deal that gets published as opinion. I think a great deal of opinion is just medium length emoting, and that has the effect not really of clarifying ideas or even conveying a real sense of kind of moral intensity or moral urgency, but simply conveying feeling. So when Dani first said that she was writing this piece, she wanted to write something about these two Australias on New Year's Eve, I was really reluctant because I've kind of taken this principled stand against just publishing emotion. But there was a crystalline quality to what Dani wrote, both in that first New Year's Eve piece, and that's what I wanted to get you to read that portion of the book from in a moment. But then the second follow-up piece on what you've termed omnicide, death and destruction on an unimaginable scale, a scale that suffocates the mind of God, as the philosopher Stanley Cavell once put it. There was something about the crystalline quality of the writing that was so different from the kind of inarticulate grief you could hear elsewhere, and the platitudes that were being rehearsed in the media, and the otherwise inarticulacy from so many politicians who just couldn't find the tone yet, but knew they didn't want to talk about climate change quite yet. There was something about the crystalline quality that conveyed, I think, an intensity that gave many other people words to be able to articulate what it is that they wanted to say, but couldn't quite get there. And so that, for me, I think was the quality of those first two pieces. They were words that got ahead of us, that let our thoughts and our emotions catch up with them. So Dani, I wonder if you wouldn't mind reading then from that Two Australias chapter.
Not at all, thank you. I do have something to say about emotion and
I know you do.
Intellect, and you can come back to that. What is it about New Year's Eve that is so powerful for people? Perhaps it is that it draws people who normally occupy separate worlds together into what seems like a shared time and space. The shift from one year to another happens for all of us simultaneously, and momentarily we share a common focus. But tonight, the countdown to midnight and the moment where the year turns falls over two Australias. The Australia that is saturated with the reality of the climate catastrophe, and the Australia for whom it remains abstract. Sure, the second Australia also knows that something is amiss. Alarming images of the fires and tragic stories of people's losses have dominated the news. But like every other story in the feed, these ones also are displaced by the next ones. There is knowing, and there is knowing. Tonight, my rage at the second Australia is palpable. I know that if I open my mouth to speak with the guy at the petrol station or with the woman handing me food at the Thai takeaway, it will seep through my words. No one wants to be hectored. Besides, when I step back and survey the various me's with some dispassion, I see the extent to which I move across a spectrum of concern. There is the furious me of this time. There is the me who swam joyously in the river at 3 in the afternoon, even as oil spills were destroying habitats and lives, or floods were devastating communities somewhere else. There was the me who never offered to leave before the fireworks. That's a reference to something in my childhood. To some not insignificant extent, who you are comes down to where you stand in relation to the catastrophe. Perhaps it is that they have not been touched yet, not yet been burned. Like pretty much every one of us who has assumed that our privileges are both deserved and eternal, they still believe they will be spared. They won't be. We won't be. Right now, it is that rage that wants to make everyone know that.
It seems to me that in that passage, in that chapter, you capture almost better than anything that I've read one of the central moral problems, I think, of this time, which is, how is it that something, a plight, a horror, the destruction of a thing of beauty, the end of an object of immeasurable preciousness, how is it that the loss of that thing or those things or that world can consume one person's soul, can haunt every waking moment. And that same thing raise barely an eyebrow from somebody else. It's not that we have moral disagreements about a single thing and we come to it with different facts or different moral convictions. It's that one experience is a consuming one and another one is almost uncomprehending. And when you talk about the two Australias, and what you're pursuing through the rest of the book, I think, is an account of the loss of preciousness, of immeasurable preciousness, something that you're trying to convey to others. But there's also a fear, I think, that undergirds the entire book, that this preciousness won't be regarded, that this loss won't even be seen, that it's not that it's even being dismissed, it's just not even being registered.
You know, the split that you're talking about is, of course, not unique to the climate catastrophe. You know, this is an experience that people who are soul sick because of the situation of Indigenous peoples, or because of the situation of asylum seekers, or the mass violence against animals, or the habitual destruction of the environment, experience all the time. And you know, Coetzee wrote of this so beautifully, as you and I have talked about in Elizabeth Costello. There's this amazing scene where she's sitting around with other people, and she says, when other people eat meat, it's as if people are sitting around saying, those lampshades, that Jew skin makes very nice lampshades. And that is so evident to her, the violence that is being committed all the time, and yet it's normalized. And so for me, I really try and write about this a lot because it seems so critical to me. It's the normalization of violence. It's the normalization of destruction that is the most invidious part of what's going on. It's the failure to notice, because it is woven into the everydayness of our lives. You know, a fossil fuel economy, it's embroidered into almost everything we do, whether we're using plastic or whether we're driving cars or whether we're turning the lights on in our houses. And so this normalization is embedded in so many of the institutions that shape how we live, that to draw your attention back to the meaning of those normalized processes, to the implications of those normalized processes for the beings who are being harmed, really takes, for most people, an act of active, explicit intervention, except when it comes to your doorstep. And so when you're in the face of it, suddenly it has a graphic quality. It's as if it's like a type of monster who, you know, is in the wall all the time, but comes out and you see it there. And then it disappears back into the fabric or the wallpaper, and you no longer see it. You just move through the room as you normally do. And I think that giving it an outline, making it present, rather than it being receding back into the normalization, is the work that we need to do, that we as writers, as artists, as activists, that's very much what we're trying to do, is to ring the bell that this is not normal. This is not normal. This cannot persist. We cannot continue to act as if none of this is happening, both from an ethical point of view and from a survival point of view, because so long as we continue with the wheels going round, these are the wheels ultimately of our own destruction. So that's the soul cry of the book, is attend, because what we attend is what we care about. What we attend to is what draws our attention. And then, but through these practices of attention, we start to shift our moral concerns and our actions.
Beautifully put. There are three things that you do in the book that I think express and almost enact the form of attentiveness that you're trying on every page to urge. I mean, one is the description of the places. I mean, your first 3 chapters are beautiful, beautiful. I mean, some of the finest literary writing I've come across in a non-literary book. The way that you give an account of the place and of the light and of the temperature of the water. Even a very, very brief passage, I think it's on the 2nd or 3rd page of your desire when you first arrive at your property to remove your shoes and to walk across the sodden ground, just to feel that immediacy. I think that the sense of the immediacy really is something else. The other thing, of course, that you do is what you do with time. It's not a long book. It doesn't take a great deal of time to read. And yet you feel time intensely. And I know that you thought a great deal about how to convey time, how to live in a particular moment, even though it's 13, 14 months now away. But the other thing are the names, Danny. The names. I kept a little list of the names of non-human beings that you recount throughout the book, from Isaac, who remains one of my favorite characters. Everyone's going to have to look who Isaac is, through to Puzzle, Zach, Ziggy, Zorro. I believe 2 of them have actually appeared on the Minefield, but that's another question. Platero, Gabriel, Jasper, Dapple, Vronsky, and then of course you've got Jimmy and Katie, Ivan, Nikolai, Fyodor, Anna, Daria, Ekaterina. I don't think I've missed, I'm sure I've missed some. The way that you populate the world with not just things, but with beings that make a claim on our attention. This brings us to the next little section. Oh, if you want to say something, go ahead, but then there's another little passage I'd love for you to read for us.
If I may, you know, often when I talk about the book, I find myself using the words "I was trying to," and I have to say, I actually wasn't trying to. I was writing what I saw, and then in retrospect, I see, oh, this is part of what was going on. This was part of the implicit intention in the writing. So let me use that unfortunate phrase, "I was trying to." We are not the only ones, we humans are not the only ones having experiences of what's going on. And I am fortunate enough to live and to have lived for a long enough time amidst these other beings for it to be patently clear to me that they are having very rich, complex and diverse experiences of the world that is unfolding, both normally and particularly during the fires. And so naming them, particularizing them, which is something that normally we only do for human beings, is one way of bringing their subjective experience into the present, that they're not, so I write a bit in the book about Levinas and this idea of ethics being the recognition that you're not the only one having an experience, that there are those who are looking back and also who have their own worlds, that we live in this world where there is a multiplicity of experiences around us, not only of animals, but of trees and of forests and of rivers, that there, yes, the experience of a tree is radically different to us, but that being is having an experience of the feeling of the wind or the heat or the lack of water in the long drought. And so bringing them in as beings amongst whom I was having experiences was part of the most important work of the book. And I think so long as we don't see that, not only do we fail to recognize our moral obligations to protect, but we also miss out. It's not just a negative story, it's a positive story about how astonishingly beautiful it is to live in a world amidst other beings who are also living in the world in their own way.
If you wouldn't mind flipping in your book to page 136. Just before we do, I'm so glad you put it that way. Morally speaking, I don't have much hesitation talking in terms of debts that are owed, or even talking about the way in which guilt can in fact be a productive moral emotion. It can, of course, be a crippling one, a debilitating one, but it can also be, Sigmund Freud once said something about anxiety, that the thing about anxiety is that it always points you towards the truth, and that's why we try to suppress it so much. Anxiety, of course, can have its deformed forms, but anxiety, much like guilt, can also point us to something, can be kind of internal register of the reality of something that is placing a command, that is making a claim upon our attention. And for me, when you give these companions that populate your world, when you give them the names, when you describe them the way that you do, this reminds us that these aren't simply negative emotions, but these are persistent invitations into lives that are richer and less impoverished than the ones that we've come to simply accept as a matter of course. So for me, there's a tremendous, I think, moral and aesthetic lesson. It's not just swallow your medicine or eat your greens. There is also a great and a rich invitation to communion. I can't find any other word than, I think, communion or companionship that runs throughout the book. Would you mind reading to us about Katie?
I can't quite remember all the details. That is one of the losses. The disintegration of memories of someone you love that happens in the months and years after they are gone. As I recall it, Katie came and bumped up against my leg with her huge face as I was pottering around in her and Jimmy's run. As was so often the case, it took me a while to snap out of my absorption in whatever I was ruminating on and understand that she had something very specific to tell me. She was persistent, and eventually I got it. She had tipped over their water. She was thirsty. I put down the bucket, walked out the gate, made my way through the tennis court turned garden, over to the tap at the end of the hose, and turned it on. While the water was running, I came back into their area and crouched on one side of their large green plastic trough, Katie on the other side, water rising in the space between us. When she put her mouth in the cool water and began to drink, she looked right at me. Amid so many shared moments, this one stands out. In the 2 or so years we had lived together, Katie had never looked me right in the face. She would stand facing the same direction as I was, but about half a metre in front of me, her nose pointing forward, one eye turned back and looking at me. Sidelong, I think they call it. That morning, however, her eyes were on mine, face to face, as she drew the cool water into her body, the water she had so desired but needed me to fetch. I said the word water, my human way of marking this sequence of our responding to each other. She looked at me and drank.
Your life with these companions, the loss of Katie, and then I'm not sure if rehabilitation is the right term, but what Jimmy taught you about grief and your attendance to Jimmy on the way back to something like finding a place in the world is a crucial narrative thread. I don't know how you found the words to do it, because somehow they're the right words. And yet as soon as I read it, I can hear philosophers talking about the dangers of anthropomorphization, of projecting human attributes or words or feelings onto creatures that obviously don't have them. I can't think of a better way of asking this, so pardon my inarticulacy. How did Jimmy teach you the right words to describe his world his place in the world, and your role to him?
So I've thought a lot about the problem of anthropomorphization. Jimmy is a relatively easy case because the expression of complex emotions that he displayed was really not mediated. So when we brought him home, that first night, you know, he went into his mud bath and he ate a little bit. And then the next day was when he fell into his grief and trauma. And it was very palpable. He lay still for a long time. He didn't eat. He looked around for Katie. He placed himself on the earth. He did a lot of the things that human beings do when they're in grief, but in a less mediated way, I think, because he doesn't have language. And so the affects were very evident. So in the case of Jimmy, and in writing that first piece about him, I have to say, all I had to do was get out of my own way. All I did was write what I saw. And that first piece I had written a version of. And then I went down. This was a very intense time for us. This was still in early January. The fires were still burning. We were still under threat. None of the other animals had come home. We had brought Jimmy home because otherwise he would have died. He needed to come here and to see if he could heal in his own place. And I walked down. He has quite a large area that he lives in, and part of it is very wooded. It's a slope down to the river. And I walked down and I sat on the ground in my own trauma, where he had been lying in his own trauma. And all I did was I was present to what I was perceiving. And what I was perceiving was the cool ground underneath me, the soft sound of the wind in the trees and the river, the smell of the grass and the leaves, the sound of the birds, the kind of sweet taste of the air. And what I saw, and I really did see it the way sometimes in the intensity of a heightened experience, you have a clarity that you don't otherwise have. That what he was doing was he was taking himself back to a world that had been exploded for him. And it made it clear to me that the world had been exploded for me also. This goes back to your earlier question about seeing and not seeing, about the normalization of extreme violence and destruction. That what happened for many of us during those catastrophic fires, and I think one of the aspects of the climate catastrophe that makes it so difficult for us to grasp, is that the very parameters of the world were unraveled. So Kant wrote about, you know, what are the parameters of human experience? Time, space, and causality. And my experience, and I think the experience of many of us during that period, and this is the reality of the climate catastrophe, is time, space, and causality don't work the way that we're used to them working. And so it's not that we can put the disaster inside our normal experience. The very parameters of our normal experience are what are disrupted. And what we think the world sounds like, what we think it feels like, what we think it tastes like, what we think it smells like, what we think it looks like, all of that for Jimmy was exploded in the inferno that he was caught in. And he is so smart. His emotional intelligence, his physical intelligence is so high that he found a way of putting back together what had been dissembled in the fire. And I went there, and I didn't make sense of this at the time, but looking back at it, I saw that he was putting his world back together again in the way that we think is the work of overcoming trauma, because trauma breaks the world apart. And so in a way, and I'm only thinking about this because you asked such wonderful questions, Scott, I want the world to be broken apart for people. I want this book, I want our words to break the world apart, because the world is breaking apart. And we need to be present to that truth, not only if we are going to act to do what we can to protect and save and nourish what it is still possible to protect and save and nourish, but also because it's the truth. And this is a very difficult part of the book. The book does not just give a salve. This is not a book saying, wake up so that you can act and so it will all be okay, because it's already not okay. And I want us to live as close as we can to the truth of what is unfolding around us, because I want us to live in the truth. It's not just instrumental, it's also an end in itself. I want us to live in the truth.
Wow. Danny, you've just given, I'm not even going to get you to read it now because I think you just put it perfectly. You have some very harsh things to say about hope throughout the book. You have some harsh things to say about lack of hope too, and you have some great warnings about despair and a kind of internal collapse. But we have, of course, instrumentalized hope. We have turned it into a narcotic. We've turned it into, we've made the need of it already a kind of bad faith moral alibi that says that things might get this bad, but there will always be that little thing at the end that then lets us off. You time and time again say, at least stand together honestly. At least stand together in truth, rather than falling back on this narcotic, this need for hope. It is worth reminding, it strikes me, that so many very, very fine philosophers, I mean, Stanley Cavell is someone who I've been reading a great deal of over the last few years. He says that not just democracy, but the work of philosophy, the work of friendships, is an alternation, a moving back and forth between despair and hope. And despair is the thing that keeps hope grounded. And hope is the thing that lets despair turn into action. And so I think that, I might, just before we have my last question, before we come to some questions from our listeners, of the audience of people who are gathered here. If we can agree that hope has this narcotic effect, and it's probably standing in the way of genuine moral action. You've already put forward truth as, I think, maybe an alternative term. Is there another disposition still? What is the better way of, if you like, comporting ourselves before this world that is? If it's not just hope, what is another way of comporting ourselves, of facing the world as it is?
Love. Because when you love through everything. You love both as what you love is dying in presence, and you love to try and keep it alive, and you love to try and let others have the best life possible. But love cleaves to the other, no matter what. Whereas, and you know, to link this to the conversation we were having earlier, the problem with hope as it has come to be used, hope is such a complex concept, but hope leaps over time. Hope takes me from this very uncomfortable place, this unbearable place where I am now, to an imagined future without me having to persist through time and through experience. Whereas love cleaves you to all of the experiences of the grief and the experiences of the joy and the experiences of the loss and the sharing. And yes, you know, anxiety and guilt and recognition of our wrongdoing will hopefully kick us in the pants to get to catalyze a recognition of the necessity of action. But only love will nourish and sustain action. And that may be in certain circles seen as a very soft or sentimental thing to say, but there is nothing sentimental about love. Love is the most difficult, the most complex. It takes the most work. It calls on us in every way to remain present and not to escape through despair and hope. I would say they're back doors from experience. They take us out of experience because we descend into them or we elevate ourselves towards them rather than remaining present to what is. And only when we remain present to what is will we have the possibility of knowing what to do. I'm talking about not a technological knowledge, but an experiential knowledge of how to respond to what is actually happening, which we can never know unless we're present to it.
Wow. Just before we go to questions, Danny mentioned it already, and Danny, I hope you're not going to get mad at me for doing this. Just before we let you all in the common room, Danny said, whatever you do, don't let anybody ask me a question, what should we do about climate change? That brought, I'm sorry, Danny, but that brought to mind an unbelievably powerful association that I had when I finished reading the first version of Danny's manuscript. There's a wonderful novel by one of my favorite novelists, J.M. Coetzee. Danny already made reference to my mind, one of his greatest novels called Elizabeth Costello. She's an Australian novelist who is haunted, is overwhelmed by what she calls inordinate knowledge of the unrelenting cruelty and callousness and brutality of our treatment of non-human animals. She's invited to a New England college to receive an award and to deliver a nice, genteel speech from an accomplished novelist. And instead, she delivers an extraordinary address about the lives of animals. There's a distinct, in James Coetzee's account, there's a distinct lack of applause at the end of her address, and a few questions begin to be raised. And one of the questions is, Miss Costello, what would you have us do? Do you just want us to close all the abattoirs and all the meat factories? Would you have us find different language for the way that we talk about animals? Would you have us all adopt vegetarian lifestyle? What would you have us do? And Elizabeth Costello's response is, open your heart. It just strikes me when I got to the end of Summertime, that fundamentally, I think, is a kind of moral plea of yours, Danny. Simply open your heart to the world that there is.
I would say open your heart and open your senses as well, because we are embodied beings. And you know, I'm not saying that Elizabeth Costello didn't mean that. I just want to flesh it out a little bit. That we feel, we sense what is happening. And so, you know, so much of, here we are in Zoom, we can see each other, but all the rest of our senses are stripped away. This is very, very problematic from the point of view of embodied communication. But part of the reason that the book is so rich with descriptions of sounds and what it feels like, what it looks like, what it smells like, is because I think that we become open, not just through some emotional turn, or, you know, as if these are abstracted from our bodies. This happens to us as embodied beings. And it's I love that you took my verboten question and turned it the way that you did. Part of the reason that it's a great question, it's an important question, but the reason that I don't want to answer that question when I'm talking about the book is that's not the work of this book. There is so much brilliant work going on by activists, by scientists, by sociologists, by all sorts of people on what we can do about the climate catastrophe. You know, join a group, take political action, etc., etc., etc. But what this book is doing is, if you like, trying to create the conditions under which we will be the people who will do those things because they're there to do. Not because Danielle Celermajer or someone else is behind you saying you really ought to do that, but because your desire inclines you to be that person. How do we speak to each other? And this is what I have. We all have our strengths. And, you know, mine is, you know, I don't want to big note myself, but that which I have been gifted with is the word, and, you know, and a beautiful education, gifted with a beautiful an amazing education. And so what I try and do with the word and all of those ideas that get to flow through the words is to perhaps just shift those with whom I am in conversation so that they are inclined towards the desire to act. That's the work of the book.
Beautifully put.
My desire for the work of the book.
Nice. Okay, I think we have some questions, I believe.
No, I think you two have been doing such a good job.
Oh, really?
People have been so riveted that we don't have any questions yet.
Well, if anybody wants to jump in, now is a wonderful chance to ask your question. Danny, you did say before, though, that you wanted to say something additional about emotion.
What I wanted to say is that I don't think, I mean, I totally hear what you say about a type of hyper-affectivity that saturates the public sphere in ways that I think are deeply problematic and anti-democratic. But I don't think that it's useful for me to think of the work of emotion and the work of what we might think of conceptual clarification as separate. And yes, there are times when I am overwhelmed by my grief or my rage. But to be perfectly honest, I do my best thinking when I am in those heightened states. They actually turn up the volume on my clarity, and they also heighten the imperative to be clear. Because when you know affectively how serious things are, then there's no nonsense about having to write clearly, having to think clearly, because you understand in an embodied way what's at stake. So that's what I wanted to say.
Look, I think that's very, very valuable. It also just marks out for me just what a different writer you in fact are. I guess one of the problems, I suppose, is many times emotions seem to me, or the kind of public performance of emotion almost functions like a planting of a flag in the ground and getting people who are already on side to rally around. Whereas the use of emotions as a way of even simply getting beneath the different layers of either critical faculty or of those kind of instinctive, that sort of instinctive reticence, that sort of off the cuff rejection. It's kind of like when somebody says to you, "Oh, you've never read Dostoevsky?" your life can't be complete unless you read Dostoevsky. And then you suddenly realize, oh my God, I've got to devote 46 hours just to get through Crime and Punishment. And so I guess when our lives are so wound through, so interwoven with various forms of cruelty and callousness and injustice, the prospect of beginning to unpick, of beginning to embody or express or articulate a life that can in fact be regarded as in some ways just or truthful, that first step can be incredibly fearful unless there's the first step, unless you know where the path opens.
And I think that unpicking, I would insist that that unpicking doesn't happen by leaving the emotions on the side of the road, but by remaining present to them and being with all of our faculties. I think when we leave them behind, when we feel that in order to be conceptually clear or to provide a poignant analysis, we need to somehow abstract ourselves. I think we lose a great deal, both of our own humanity, but also of our capacity to speak to each other, because we speak to each other, you know, on all of these levels. We resonate in, you know, on multiple registers.
Well said. I think we have some questions.
Yes, we do. This one's from Jason. Hi, Danny. Sorry to ask this, but is there anything to be done about those who are resistant or in denial of the experiences you describe in the book? Wow. Insofar as exposure to adequate experience seems to be the implicit logic of the discussion.
Great question.
It depends. It's a really important question. It depends. You know, I don't think we can lump together everybody who is in denial. I think there are different bases of denial. If we're talking about the invested climate denier, the person whose identity is forged in being a climate denier, I only have so much energy. I only, you know, my 46 hours of Dostoevsky are not going to be devoted to taking on those particular types of arguments, because I think the argument is what the investment is in. You know, there is an investment in an oppositional conversation. And so I just won't enter into that field, because I think that's what they're after, right? It's positional. And I don't think that positional conversations benefit anyone.
But Danny, what about those who say you're just projecting on Jimmy and on Katie? You want there to be something there, because if what you're describing about the lives of these non-human animals is true, my God, what have I been doing?
Well, then I think there is a very slow process that needs to take place of that person being able to come to terms with the implications of their actions. And that's difficult work. You know, when we come face to face with the violence that we have been committing, it's not an easy place to be. Now, I don't want to imply that I'm going to go in and do psychotherapy with people, but I think being sensitive to what it is that motivates denial is important. And in relation to issues like violence against animals and violence against the environment, there is a lot of motivation to be in denial. And so what I was going to say before you asked that really useful question or made that useful point, Scott, was storytelling is one way just to move to the side a little bit. So I'm not giving you a lecture about animal sentience. I'm telling you a story of something that happened. And human beings love stories. We're storytelling and story listening animals. And I find that when you tell a story, and it was very interesting, when I wrote about Jimmy in January 2020, many people responded to that story who I don't think were particularly alive to the complex sentience of animals other than humans. And I didn't write it because, oh, this is a clever way to get them on board. But after I wrote it, I saw that. And so in a way, by storytelling, what we're doing is kind of putting an arm around the person and saying, come look at this world with me. Let's walk together and look at this world and see what we see. And maybe you'll see a little bit of what I see. And then maybe you'll walk away. You might not see everything that I see, but maybe you'll see a little bit of it. And then you'll start to unpick your assumptions in your own time. I'm not going to do all of that work, but I could just invite you in gently so that you could start to, again, see that you might want to do that work for yourself.
Wow, nice.
We've got another question here from Moira. In your other work, e.g. on torture, you've stressed the institutional and structural power of human agency. How does that insight figure here? And hang on, there's a little bit more down here. How can institutions help to shift the dispositions you want to shift?
That's a predictably difficult and great question, Moira. So there is a danger in speaking about the way in which individual human beings hold, let's take animals, of individualizing those dispositions as if they are just things that we choose as individuals, as distinct from us being embedded in a set of institutions. And by institutions, I don't just mean organizations, I also mean the basic distinctions that organize how we think about the world. So basic institution, we think that human beings are absolutely distinct from everything else, that we have souls, or we have reason, or we're made in the image of God. There are a whole lot of different ways of doing it. So again, this is the difficult work of storytelling, and it's what I try and do in the book, is to move between the particular story that demonstrates the problematic nature of those institutions. I'm just talking about sense-making institutions. And then to talk about the institution itself. So for example, there's a part in the book where I talk about the problem of anthropomorphism. I talk about the difficulty of projection, and the way that I try and articulate in the book is I say, look, one of the things that we've done is we've taken all of the best words for ourselves and we've attached them to what they mean for human beings. So when we talk about agency, the model of agency is the model of human agency. And then when you apply it to other beings, someone will say, oh yes, but you're anthropomorphizing. And so what I try and do in the book is point out, yes, but maybe we need to rethink the way that those words operate by applying them, or see what they might mean when other beings can also have agency. So that's one type of institution. But then there are the other types of institutions, the hard institutions that organize the movements of our life, the way in which we move through the world, the things that we do, like animal agriculture, for example, which renders invisible the violence that underpins the production of food. So, you know, classic example, one thing that I've noticed, very few people actually realize that in order to produce milk, a cow has to have a calf, and that cows don't just routinely produce milk. That is rendered completely invisible. Most people don't even know that cows have to be forced or are forcibly impregnated, give birth to a calf, and then the calf is taken away, and if it's a female, it's made into a dairy cow. If it's a boy, it's killed. That is rendered invisible by a set of institutional practices that place the creation of this product that we then consume at such a distance from us that we are completely unaware of the conditions of possibility for our own everyday consumption. So rendering those institutional practices visible is going to also be a necessary condition of people recognising that what they take for granted, what structures their everyday actions, in fact, encodes a great deal of violence. That's a very partial answer to a much bigger question.
It is 7:30, but I will just pass you this last comment question from Paula. There's enough love in our humanity to hold us if we were all to live in the receptive presence. Is that the soul call of your book?
Oh no, it's not the soul call of my book. Scott was asking me what would I put in place of hope, and I offered love, but love ain't enough. You know, it also takes organisation, it takes work, it takes resistance, it takes the work of shifting institutional practices. You know, I think love is a necessary but not a sufficient condition if we are going to begin to unravel the normalization of violence that pervades the production of energy, the production of food, our transport systems, our work lives. Then we need to do a great deal of work at the political level, at the economic level, at the legal level, at the social level, and at the cultural level. This is a multi-systemic ecology of violence within which we live. So there is, if I have given the impression that I think love is enough, perhaps I can end with the much harder edge of work that lays before us. The love just makes you want to do the work.
Wow.
Thank you so much, both of you. What a fantastic discussion. And we do have copies of Summertime here at Better Read Than Dead, a limited number, but so please come into the store and get your copy. If we run out, we'll get more. So thanks everyone for joining us tonight. Thanks, Scott and Danielle, for
Thank you all
a great
of you.
conversation.
Thank you, Scott.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Better Read Than Dead. Thank you everybody for coming.
Thanks.